What stays with me is the silence most of all. Not the silence of peace. We'd never known that on Vardus Prime, but the silence that came after the last of our PDF regiments stopped screaming into the Vox, after the orbital guns went dark, after the final chimera burned itself out in the central plaza, while something massive and green tore through its armor plating with bare hands. The temperature in our shelter was 37 degrees Celsius, the air thick with the breath of 43 other people pressed into a space designed for 20, and through the ventilation grills I could smell burning promethium mixed with something else, something organic and rotten sweet that I would later learn was the scent of orc spores beginning to take root in our soil. My name was Davrin Kell. I was 22 years old. I worked in the agricultural administration complex, calculating crop yields and managing distribution schedules for the sector. I had a father who ran a small repair shop in the mid-hive, and I had genuinely believed, that the Emperor's protection meant something, that when the green-skinned Xenos came, the Imperium would save us. The war lasted 17 days. What came after lasted 20 years. By the end, I would have trouble remembering which was worse.
The bombing had started 3 weeks before the invasion proper, random and sporadic, like a child testing which parts of a machine would break first. We lost the eastern agri-complexes on day 4, when something crude and massive crashed through the atmosphere and detonated with enough force to create a mushroom cloud, visible from 300 kilometers away. The planetary governor declared martial law on day 6, which meant nothing because the PDF was already stretched thinner than cathedral incense. Young conscripts with laser guns they barely knew how to maintain, standing at checkpoints and trying not to look terrified. I remember passing through one of those checkpoints on day 9, heading to work because what else was there to do, and seeing the guard's hands shaking so badly he could barely scan my identification chip. He was maybe 19 years old, his uniform still crisp because he had probably never worn it before this crisis, and when I met his eyes, I saw a terror so absolute it was like staring into a void. "They're coming," he whispered to me, voice cracking. "I've heard the Vox traffic. They're coming, and there's so many of them." He was dead within 72 hours. They were all dead within 72 hours. The orcs hit the northern gate at dawn on day 15 with what our few surviving military analysts would later describe as overwhelming kinetic enthusiasm. I wasn't there, but I heard it. Everyone in the hive heard it, the sound of metal being torn, of explosions that made the ground ripple like water, of something that might have been war cries or might have been laughter, impossible to tell the difference. The Vox channels dissolved into static and screaming. I was in the shelter by then, had been for 36 hours straight, and we listened to the world ending above us, with nothing to do but wait. Someone had brought a small shrine to the Emperor, and we took turns praying. Mechanical words that felt hollow even as we spoke them. "The Emperor protects," we chanted over and over, while the ceiling rained dust and the sounds of destruction grew closer. I stopped believing those words somewhere around hour 40. The Emperor wasn't here. The Emperor had never been here. We were alone with the green tide. The door to our shelter broke inward on day 17, metal screaming as something impossibly strong simply tore through the reinforced hinges. I expected death. We all expected death. Instead, we got examination. The orc that ducked through the entrance, and ducked, is doing heavy lifting there. It was nearly 3 meters tall and had to fold itself nearly in half. Swept its gaze across all of us with an expression I couldn't read. Red eyes in a brutish face, skin the color of forest moss, tusks yellow with what looked like rust stains but was probably blood. It wore armor that looked like it had been assembled from scrap metal and faith, pieces of Imperial vehicles bolted to orc-made plates, all of it covered in crude glyphs that seemed to writhe when you looked at them too long. It sniffed the air, making a sound deep in its chest like rocks grinding together, then spoke in low Gothic so mangled I barely understood it. "You lot, out, fight or don't. Boss'll sort it." Then it left, just left. We sat in stunned silence for probably 10 minutes before someone had the courage to move. Outside, the world had been transformed. The neat, ordered streets of Vardis Prime's capital had become a maze of wreckage and crude fortifications. Orc constructs loomed everywhere, massive, illogical structures that seemed to defy physics and good sense in equal measure. All sharp angles and exposed machinery and metal plates welded together with what looked like blind optimism. Fires burned in oil drums, scattered randomly through the plaza. The air was thick with black smoke and that omnipresent spore smell, making my eyes water and my throat close. Bodies littered the ground, though fewer than I'd expected. Most seemed to have been moved, piled in specific locations for reasons I couldn't fathom. And everywhere, orcs. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them, some massive and covered in even cruder armor, others smaller and more feral-looking, all of them moving with a purposeful chaos that made my head hurt trying to track it. They were building something. No, they were rebuilding everything. The war boss held court in what had been the governor's palace, a building of white marble and soaring buttresses that represented 3 centuries of imperial architecture. The orcs had improved it. Massive metal plates covered the facade, held in place by rivets the size of my head. Gun emplacements jutted from windows at random angles. The steps had been torn up and replaced with crude metal stairs that clanged and shifted under your weight. Inside, the vaulted ceilings dripped with chains and cables, and the polished marble floors were covered in a layer of grime and machine oil, thick enough to leave footprints. The war boss himself, Warlord Scragclaw, I would learn, a name that felt like violence in your mouth, sat on a throne made from the governor's personal chimera, the vehicle crushed and bent into a rough seat shape that still had scorched paint and blood stains visible on the metal. He was enormous even for an orc, easily 4 meters tall when he stood, muscles like bundles of cables under green hide that was covered in scars and crude tattoos. When he spoke, the floor vibrated. "Right, Den," Scragclaw said, addressing the crowd of terrified humans that had been herded into the throne room, maybe 200 of us, all that could fit in the space. "We won. Dat's dat. Good scrap. You humies put up a proper fight at day end there, but we won. Now." He paused, and in that silence I heard something that made my blood freeze. Uncertainty. The orc was uncertain. "Now he's got a problem, see? We won. War's done, but we ain't leaving. Can't leave, that'd be unorky, abandoning a good conquest. Wah, still has momentum, see? Still got the energy flowing, so we stayin'." Another pause, longer this time. "Problem is, there ain't nothing to fight no more." The way he said it, you could hear genuine distress in that gravelly voice. "We's bored." If you already feel the weight of that impossible statement settling in your chest like ice water, honor those who would learn its true meaning. Leave a comment with the word "witnessed" and subscribe so their story endures beyond the silence of the Imperium's abandonment. The first month was adjustment. The orcs didn't kill us systematically. There was no great purge, no mass executions. They simply took over. The water reclamation plant was seized and improved with orc technology that somehow made everything work at 300% capacity while threatening to explode every few hours. The power grid was torn apart and rebuilt according to Orky principles, which meant blackouts happened randomly, but when power was on, it was on with enough voltage to make lights burst and machinery whine. Food distribution became a matter of showing up to designated areas where orcs would throw ration packs, some Imperial, some clearly looted from other worlds, some of mysterious and disturbing origin, had gathered crowds. The weak starved, the strong adapted. I fell somewhere in the middle, thin enough to feel my ribs, but not so desperate that I would kill for a meal. Not yet. They divided the city into zones. We learned this through trial and error, through watching people wander into areas they shouldn't and either return shaken or not return at all. The central districts became Dabos's territory, where only orcs and specifically permitted humans could go. The mid-hive became Damek yards, where orc engineers, if that word could be applied to creatures who built by instinct and violence, set up workshops that rang day and night with hammering and grinding metal and occasional explosions. The outer districts became Dahumi pens, where most of us were concentrated, living in buildings that the orcs had marked with crude glyphs that apparently meant, "Don't smash this yet." My father's repair shop was in one of the mech yards. I didn't see him for 6 weeks. When I finally found him, he was working for an orc mech boy, helping to sort scrap metal by type, his hands cut to ribbons from handling sharp edges without gloves, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "It's not so bad," he told me, voice flat. "They feed me better than the ration drops, and if I'm useful, they won't kill me." He wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it. The boredom started showing around week 8. Orcs, I learned, are not built for peace. They're walking biological weapons, creatures genetically engineered for combat, and without combat they begin to deteriorate. No, that's not the right word. Devolve isn't right either. They begin to seek stimulation, any stimulation, with increasingly desperate creativity. It started with fights among themselves, impromptu brawls in the streets that would draw crowds of other orcs who would watch and cheer and occasionally join in. Melees that left craters in the pavement and buildings with new holes punched through their walls. Then the fights got organized. Someone, probably multiple someones, got the idea to make it structured. The first arena appeared in what had been the central market square, a crude ring surrounded by scrap metal walls, and orcs would compete there in combat trials that followed rules I never fully understood. It was during one of these fights, watching 2 massive orcs beat each other bloody while hundreds of their kin screamed encouragement, that I saw a human in the ring. His name had been Torven Marks. I knew him vaguely from the agricultural administration. He'd worked in logistics, a quiet man in his 30s with a family in the lower hive. The orcs had given him a crude axe, something that looked like it had been made from a sharpened piece of whole plating attached to a pipe, and they'd put him up against another human, a younger man I didn't recognize who held a makeshift club. Both men were crying. The orc, overseeing the fight, a massive specimen with a crude electrified prod, roared something in its own language, and the two humans circled each other with visible reluctance, neither wanting to make the first move. The crowd of orcs began to boo, a sound like a landslide, and the overseer jabbed his prod into Torvin's back. Electricity crackled. Torvin screamed and swung wildly. His axe caught the younger man in the shoulder, and blood sprayed across the dirt. After that, it was butchery. Torvin won. He was allowed to live. The corpse of his opponent was dragged away to the Emperor knows where. When they let Torvin out of the ring, he was shaking so hard his knees gave out, and he vomited until nothing came up but bile and blood. The arenas multiplied. Within 3 months there were 5 across the city, each one drawing crowds of orcs who would bet on outcomes using currency I never understood. Teeth, apparently, were valuable to them, along with scrap metal of certain types and other items that made no logical sense. Humans became regular participants, though participants is generous when most of us were dragged to the rings by orc press gangs that would sweep through the Humy pens looking for anyone who looked strong enough to put up a fight. I was taken on month 4. They threw me into a ring with 2 other humans and a crude weapon that might have started life as a piece of rebar. "Fight!" the overseer roared. "Last one standing gets extra rations for a week. The rest get choppy." We fought. Of course we fought. What choice did we have? I killed a man that day. I don't know his name, never learned it, probably never will. I remember the feeling of the rebar connecting with his skull, the way the bone gave and something wet splashed across my hands, the way his eyes went from terrified to empty in less than a second. I remember vomiting afterward, just like Torvin had. I remember the extra rations tasting like ash and copper. I remember not being able to sleep for 3 days without seeing that moment replayed behind my eyelids. Should they have had a choice? Should any of us? Let your like be the mercy they never received, the witness to suffering the Imperium would never acknowledge. Month 6 brought the improvements to our infrastructure. The orcs had grown dissatisfied with the city's layout, finding it too unorky for their tastes. What followed was urban redesign by committee if the committee was composed of enthusiastic vandals with access to industrial equipment. They tore down the cathedral first, a building that had stood for 800 years, its spires reaching toward the sky like prayers made stone, and replaced it with something that looked like a pile of scrap metal had been struck by lightning and achieved sentience. It served no obvious function beyond existing and occasionally belching black smoke from apertures that might have been windows or might have been exhaust ports. The banking district became a massive workshop where orc vehicles were assembled in a process that seemed to involve more explosions than engineering. The residential towers where I'd lived, neat hab blocks with running water and functioning elevators, were enhanced with external scaffolding covered in spikes, their interiors gutted and rebuilt to orc proportions, which meant ceilings 3 meters high and doorways wide enough to accommodate their bulk. The few humans still living in those buildings had to adapt or relocate. Most relocated. The roads became racetracks. This happened gradually, but by month 8 it was undeniable. The orcs had begun constructing vehicles, ramshackle assemblies of salvaged parts and pure belief that somehow achieved motion despite violating every principle of engineering I'd ever learned. Trucks, they called them, open-topped transports covered in armor plates and mounted weapons that looked one jostle away from detonating. Buggies, smaller and faster, with wheels stolen from every type of vehicle imaginable. Battle wagons, massive things that were more mobile fortresses than transports, bristling with guns and covered in screaming orcs. And they raced them through the streets at speeds that defied sanity. I watched a truck take a corner at what must have been 80 kilometers per hour, its wheels leaving the ground, half its passengers flying off the back to bounce and roll across the pavement. The driver's response was to laugh, actually laugh, and accelerate. The orcs that had fallen simply got up, dusted themselves off, and ran after the vehicle, still laughing. Those that didn't get up were left where they fell, obstacles for the next racer. Humans became obstacles too, of course. The orcs didn't deliberately target us. It wasn't malicious, which somehow made it worse. We were simply in the way. I saw a mother and her child crushed under the wheels of a battle wagon that took a turn too wide, the driver barely noticing the bump. I saw a group of workers trying to cross a main thoroughfare obliterated when two trucks collided at the intersection, the explosion of poorly secured promethium tanks turning a 50-meter radius into an inferno. I saw bodies pulped into the pavement, smeared across walls, hanging from vehicle chassis like grotesque trophies. The orcs would sometimes collect the corpses, sometimes leave them. I never figured out the logic, if there was any. By month 9, we learned to stay off the main roads entirely, traveling only through alleyways and buildings, listening always for the roar of engines that meant death was approaching at terminal velocity. The hunt zones appeared in month 10. Some orc with more cruel imagination than most, decided that static combat in arenas was becoming stale and that mobile prey would provide better entertainment. They cordoned off entire districts, the southern residential quarter becoming the first designated hunting ground, and began releasing humans into it with a 15-minute head start. Then the orcs would enter, armed with crude weapons or sometimes no weapons at all, and the chase would begin. They set up viewing platforms where other orcs could watch, treated it like sport, laid bets on who would make the best kills. The hunted had no weapons, no armor, nothing but whatever they could scavenge from the ruins. Some tried to hide, burrowing into basements or sealing themselves in closets. The orcs always found them. They could smell fear, apparently, or maybe they just had better hearing than us, could detect a heartbeat through walls. Some tried to run, using speed and knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead. That worked better, but never permanently. The hunts lasted until all the prey were dead, or, occasionally, until the orcs got bored and left. Survivors were sometimes returned to the pens. Sometimes they were kept for the next hunt. Sometimes they simply disappeared into the orc logistics system, purposes unknown. I was never selected for a hunt, and I don't know whether that was luck or something else. I'd become useful by then, had found a niche that kept me visible enough to avoid press gangs, but not so important that I'd be noticed if the boss decided to purge his human staff. I worked in what the orcs called the talkie place, a ramshackle building near the throne room where they kept humans who could read and write High Gothic to help translate captured Imperial documents. Most of what came through was useless: supply manifests, personnel records, bureaucratic paperwork from a government that no longer existed, but occasionally there were strategic documents, troop movements for regiments that hadn't arrived yet, defensive plans for neighboring systems. I translated. The orcs absorbed the information in ways I didn't understand, and I received regular meals and a relatively safe place to sleep. My father would have called it collaboration. My father was dead by then, crushed in a mech yard accident when an orc vehicle fell off its repair cradle. So I didn't have to hear his judgment. Year 2 brought what I can only describe as normalization. The initial shock had faded. The daily horror became routine. You adapted or you died, and most of us chose adaptation with a fervor that, in retrospect, is more disturbing than the alternative would have been. Humans began to learn Orcish, not from any formal teaching, but through immersion, the same way you'd learn any language when your survival depended on understanding. Simple words at first: zog, an expletive, wa. War/energy/enthusiasm. The meaning was contextual. Choppy, violence. Daka, gunfire. Boss, self-explanatory. Then more complex phrases, sentence structures, the crude but functional grammar of a species that had language but no written tradition. Children picked it up fastest, of course. I watched kids who'd been 8 or 9 when the orcs arrived become fluent by age 10, conversing with orc overseers in their own tongue, laughing at jokes I couldn't pass, integrating themselves into the occupier's culture with a flexibility that adults couldn't match. Some humans went further than survival integration. They became enthusiasts, collaborators in the truest sense, adopting Orci culture not because they had to, but because they wanted to, finding in the brutal simplicity of Orc society something that spoke to them in ways the Imperium never had. I watched men begin to dress in crude imitations of Orc fashion, wearing scrap metal armor and painting themselves green with makeshift dyes. I watched them adopt orc mannerisms, the aggressive posturing, the loud boasting, the casual violence that passed for communication among the greenskins. They sought positions in orc war bands, serving as assistants and gophers, and occasionally fighters, proving their worth through displays of brutality that would have seen them executed as psychopaths before the invasion. The orcs seemed to find this amusing. They had a word for these humans, weedy gits, said with what might have been affection or might have been contempt. I could never tell. Some of the weedy gits were accepted into orc society to surprising degrees, given responsibilities and even crude authority over other humans. Some were used and discarded when they ceased being entertaining. The line between the two outcomes was invisible until you crossed it. By year 5, the population stabilization had completed. We'd started with approximately 11 million people on Vardis Prime, a respectable population for an agri-world of our size. The initial invasion and the chaotic first year reduced that number by maybe 40%. 4 million dead from combat, starvation, disease, casual violence, and simple despair. The next 4 years took another 30% as the orc occupation ground people down through arena fights, hunts, industrial accidents, and the general attrition of living in a society where safety standards were non-existent and medical care meant hope you don't get infected. We were down to roughly 3 million survivors by year 5, but that number stabilized. The orcs had found equilibrium, had determined how many humans they needed for labor and entertainment and logistics, and they maintained that number through a careful balance of brutality and neglect. We were livestock, essentially, kept healthy enough to be useful, culled when populations grew too large, bred when numbers got too low. I hate using that word. bread. But it's accurate. The orcs encouraged human reproduction, offering better rations to pregnant women and protecting children until they were old enough to work. They needed a stable supply of future slaves, and they got it. Comment where you're watching from. Let them know someone, somewhere, remembers the names of worlds the Imperium abandoned to their fate. The race tracks had become permanent fixtures by year 7. The orcs had torn up entire city blocks to create courses that wound through the urban landscape, loops and straightaways marked with crude barriers and checkpoints. They held races weekly, sometimes daily, massive events that would draw hundreds of orcs and their vehicles, the roar of engines and the thunder of weapons fire. They shot at each other during races. Apparently that was part of the fun, audible from kilometers away. The courses ran through remaining residential areas, and humans learned to recognize the warning signs. Increased orc activity, vehicles gathering at starting points, the peculiar electricity in the air that came before violence. When a race was about to begin, we would seal ourselves inside whatever buildings we occupied, barricade the entrances, and wait for the storm to pass. Sometimes buildings took damage from crashes or stray gunfire. Sometimes they collapsed entirely. The orcs would clear the rubble eventually, usually by pushing it to the sides with crude bulldozer vehicles, creating walls of compacted debris and bodies that marked the course boundaries. I watched a race from a third-story window once, unable to look away despite knowing better. It was mesmerizing in its chaos. 20 or more vehicles hurtling through streets at suicidal speeds, their drivers screaming what might have been war cries or might have been joy, passengers firing weapons at each other and at nothing in particular. The whole procession leaving destruction in its wake like a mobile natural disaster. A truck lost control and crashed through the wall of the building directly across from mine. The impact so violent it took out 3 floors of structure and sent the building slowly tilting to one side. The orcs in the truck crawled out of the wreckage laughing, one of them missing an arm but seemingly unbothered by this development, and they commandeered another vehicle that had stopped to watch, throwing its driver out and resuming the race. The tilting building collapsed an hour later, killing everyone inside who hadn't evacuated fast enough. The orcs used the rubble to improve the track, creating a jump ramp. They named it Humie Crunch Corner, and it became a popular feature. The children began to frighten me around year 8. Not because they were violent, though some were, absorbing the casual brutality of orc culture like sponges soaking up water, but because they were adapted. Kids who'd been born just before the invasion, who were now 8 or 9 years old, had spent most of their lives under orc occupation. This was normal to them. The racetracks were just part of the landscape. The arenas were entertainment venues. The orcs were simply the dominant species, the ones in charge, no more strange than adults had been in the old world. They spoke Orcish fluently, better than most adults, and used it as their primary language among themselves. They played games that mimicked orc behavior. Mock fights with scrap weapons, races through dangerous areas, contests of pain tolerance that left them scarred and grinning. They showed orc flags and symbols carved into their skin, self-inflicted marks of allegiance to a culture that wasn't theirs but had become theirs through simple exposure. I tried talking to one once, a boy named Keras, who couldn't have been more than 10 but already had the hard eyes of someone much older. He was working in the talkie place, running messages between buildings, and I asked him what he remembered from before the orcs came. He looked at me like I'd asked him to describe a dream. "Not much," he said in high Gothic that carried a strong orcish accent. "Was different, yeah. Quieter, boring." Boring. He described the Imperium as boring. I asked him if he wanted to go back to that, if he'd want the orcs to leave. He considered this with far too much seriousness for a child. "Why?" he finally asked. "Orcs are here now. This is how things are. Why would I want different?" I didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe I did, and it was too horrifying to voice. Because he was right. This was how things were now. We'd adapted. We'd changed. And maybe that change was worse than the occupation itself. Year 10 brought the schism, though we didn't call it that at the time. We called it the fight, simple and reductive. But it captured the essence of what happened. Rumors had been circulating for months. Whispers passed through the human pens, fragments of information from orc conversations overheard and misunderstood, that an Imperial fleet had been spotted in neighboring sectors. The Imperium was coming. Liberation was possible. Hope, that dangerous and fragile thing, began to take root in the hearts of survivors who'd spent a decade learning not to hope. People prayed again, real prayers with feeling behind them, not the rote mechanical chants we'd used for years. People began to plan, secret meetings in basements and abandoned buildings, discussions of how we'd help the liberation forces, what information we could provide, how we'd resist the orcs when the moment came. It felt like waking up after a long sleep, consciousness returning to limbs that had been numb. But not everyone felt that way. The weedy gits, the orc collaborators who'd integrated themselves deeply into greenskin culture, saw the rumors not as hope, but as threat. They liked their positions, crude as they were. They liked the clarity of orc society, where strength mattered and status was earned through violence rather than birth or bureaucracy. Some had come from the bottom of Imperial society, underhive scum, minor criminals, workers with no prospects, and under the orcs they'd found purpose and even respect. The idea of returning to Imperial rule, of losing everything they'd built, terrified them. Others had simply been changed too much by 10 years of immersion in orc culture, their minds reshaped by constant exposure to casual violence and brutal simplicity until they couldn't conceive of living any other way. And the children, the ones like Keras who'd grown up knowing nothing else, genuinely didn't understand what the fuss was about. This was their normal. Why would they want it to change? The fight started in the Western Pen, sparked by an argument between two groups over whether to prepare for liberation or to warn the orcs of potential human resistance. It spread like fire through Prometheum, violence begetting violence, humans killing humans while the orcs watched with what might have been confusion or might have been amusement. I wasn't there when it started, but I saw the aftermath. Bodies in the streets, crude weapons discarded or still clutched in dead hands, buildings burned by fires that were still smoldering. The orcs let it play out for 3 days before intervening, and their intervention was characteristically brutal. They simply rolled in with vehicles and started crushing anyone still fighting, not discriminating between factions, just ending the violence through overwhelming application of force. When it was over, maybe 5,000 humans were dead, killed by each other rather than by the occupiers. The orcs seemed genuinely puzzled by the whole affair. "Why you lot fightin' each other?" one of them asked me, in his fractured Gothic. "We's the enemy, yeah, not each other." I couldn't explain it to him. I wasn't sure I understood it myself. This cycle has repeated across conquered worlds for millennia. If you think it must be witnessed to be believed, let your engagement be the prayer the Emperor never answered. Like and subscribe. Year 15 brought contact. An Imperial scout ship jumped into the system, conducted a brief survey, and jumped out before the Orcs could effectively respond. They had been spotted, which meant the Imperium knew Varda's prime was occupied, which meant a response was being planned. The knowledge spread through the human population faster than any Vox communication could have carried it, whispered from person to person, hope and fear mixing into something that tasted like metal and made your chest tight. The Orcs knew something had changed. They could sense the shift in human behavior, the way we moved differently, spoke differently, carried ourselves with a tension that hadn't been there before. War Boss Scragclaw called an assembly, dragging thousands of humans to the throne room and the plazas around it, packing us in until we could barely move. The press of bodies and the heat and the smell of fear, sweat making the air thick enough to choke on. "Right," Scragclaw boomed, his voice carrying across the crowd like thunder. "We's heard you Humies been talking about your old bosses coming back, the Emperor's boys or whatever." He paused, and in that pause the silence was absolute. Thousands of humans holding their breath in unison. "Here's the thing, they might come, might not. Don't matter to us. We's fought Imperials before. We'll fight 'em again if they show up. But you lot?" Another pause, longer, and when he continued his voice had dropped to something that might have been conversational if conversations were held in avalanches. "You lot got a choice to make. You can help your old bosses, try to fight us from die inside. Some of you will. We know that. Or you can stay as you are, keep doing what you've been doing, and when the fight comes, you stay out of it. Live through it. Keep living after, whoever wins." He leaned forward on his throne, the metal creaking under his weight, and those red eyes swept across the crowd. "But notice, if we catch you helping the Imperials, we'll kill you. Not just you, everyone you know, your whole pen, every last git. We'll make it slow. We'll make it painful. We'll make it a lesson." The silence stretched out, pregnant with horror. "But if you stay neutral, if you just keep your heads down, we'll remember that. When this is done, whoever's left, we'll remember who helped and who didn't." He sat back. "That's all. Go home. Think about it." We went home. We thought about it. The city felt different afterward, charged with invisible tension, every interaction between humans carrying weight it hadn't before. Who would resist? Who would collaborate? Who would try to stay neutral, and was that even possible? Friendships fractured. Families split. The weedy gits became more obvious in their allegiance, painting themselves green with pride, while the resistance, what little of it existed, went deeper underground, meeting in secret and planning actions they'd probably never take. The Imperial fleet arrived in year 20, and it was glorious. 63 ships of varying sizes, from massive cruisers that hung in the void like cathedrals of steel, to smaller frigates and destroyers that darted between the larger vessels like predatory fish. I watched from the surface as they achieved orbit, their hulls catching the light of Vardus Prime's sun, the sight of them bringing tears to my eyes for the first time in years. The Emperor had not forgotten us. The Imperium had returned. we would be saved. The orbital bombardment began 3 hours later. The Orcs had constructed defensive positions on the surface, massive gun emplacements and void shield generators assembled from salvaged Imperial technology and Orc innovation. Structures that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. The Imperial fleet couldn't risk a ground assault with those defenses active, so they opened fire from orbit, lance strikes and macro cannon shells screaming down through the atmosphere to impact fortifications with the force of small nuclear weapons. They were aiming for Orc positions. They were careful, relatively speaking. But orbital bombardment is not a precision instrument, and the Orc fortifications were built into the city, among us, using our buildings as foundations and our population as shields. The Eastern District, where 3 million people had been concentrated, took a direct hit from what must have been a lance battery. The temperature at the impact point probably reached tens of thousands of degrees. Everything within a 5-kilometer radius simply ceased to exist, vaporized instantly. The shock wave flattened everything within 20 kilometers. The firestorm that followed burned for 2 days. 500,000 people died in that first strike. Maybe more, impossible to count when most of them were reduced to ash and vapor. The bombardment continued for a week, methodical and devastating. The Imperial fleet burning away Orc fortifications and everything around them with the clinical detachment of surgeons excising tumors. We huddled in whatever shelter we could find, basements and tunnels and reinforced structures, listening to the world ending above us for the second time in 20 years. But this time felt different. The Orcs had been chaotic, brutal, immediate. But they'd let us live because we were useful. The Imperium was methodical, righteous, distant, and they couldn't see individuals from orbit. We were acceptable casualties, collateral damage in the liberation of an Imperial world. The math was simple. A few million civilians lost now versus an Orc-controlled planet producing more greenskins forever. The Imperium made the logical choice. They always made the logical choice. The Emperor protects, but from orbit you can't tell the difference between an Orc and a human, and when you're not sure, you fire anyway. The ground assault came in week 2. Drop pods and Valkyries screaming down through the atmosphere, disgorging thousands of Imperial Guard regiments and supporting elements. They hit the Orc positions hard, coordinated strikes that showed decades of anti-Xenos doctrine, and the Orcs responded with their characteristic enthusiasm, meeting Imperial steel with green fury and improvised brilliance. The war for Vardis Prime's surface lasted 3 months, and it was the worst 3 months of my life, worse than the initial invasion. Worse than the years of occupation. We were caught in the middle, literally and figuratively, humans trying to survive while 2 massive forces ground each other to paste all around us. Some humans joined the Imperial forces, revealing themselves as loyalists and offering intelligence about Orc positions. Some of them were useful. Most were executed, accused of collaboration and dealt with summarily by commissars who couldn't distinguish between survived by working for the enemy and enthusiastic traitor. The weedy gits fought for the Orcs, openly and without apology, taking up crude weapons and defending their adopted masters with a fervor that disturbed even some of the greenskins. I watched Kiras, that 10-year-old boy who was 20 now, die in combat against Imperial Guard, his body cut down by lasgun fire while he charged a defensive position screaming Orc war cries. He died thinking he was fighting for his people, and maybe he was. The orcs had become his people more thoroughly than the Imperium ever had. The Imperials who killed him probably never thought twice about it. Just another hostile target, another body in the count. They didn't know his name. They didn't know he'd been 8 when the orcs came, that he'd adapted because adaptation was survival, that he'd become what he needed to be to live. They just knew he was shooting at them, and that was enough. As this nightmare reaches what the Imperium would call victory, if any part of this moved you, give them the one thing they never had: recognition. Leave eternal in the comments for those caught between monsters. The orcs broke in month 4, not because they were beaten. I don't think you can truly beat orcs. They enjoy fighting too much to consider it a loss, but because war boss Scragclaw was killed in combat against an Imperial tank column, and without his leadership, the war energy that had held the war band together dissipated. The orcs fragmented into smaller groups, some fleeing into the wilderness, some fighting to the last, some apparently deciding that the Imperials were providing good enough sport to stick around for a bit longer. The Imperial forces declared victory, raised the Aquila over what remained of the governor's palace, the orcs' throne room, which had been their throne room before that, and began the process of pacification and recovery, which meant executing anyone they deemed contaminated by Xeno's influence, which meant most of us. The tribunals were swift. Too swift for proper investigation, but that wasn't the point. The point was to excise any trace of orc influence, to purge the population of anyone who'd collaborated or adapted or simply survived in ways that made the Imperium uncomfortable. The weedy gits were obvious targets. Those who'd painted themselves green or fought alongside orcs were executed immediately, their bodies burned to prevent spore contamination. But the definition expanded quickly. Spoke orcish, contaminated, worked in orc facilities, collaborator, children raised during occupation, too corrupted to salvage. The firing squads worked around the clock. Thousands of people shot and burned, the smell of promethium and cooking meat hanging over the city like a pall. I watched children executed, teenagers who'd never known anything but orc occupation, killed for the crime of adapting to circumstance. I watched families torn apart, parents executed while children were sent to Schola Progenium for rehabilitation. That was probably just slower death. I survived the first round of tribunals by virtue of my work in the talkie place. I had documentation showing I'd translated captured documents, which could be spun as intelligence work for future liberation rather than collaboration. But I saw the way the commissars looked at me, the distrust in their eyes, the assumption of guilt that underlay every question. I spoke orcish, not fluently, but enough to get by. I understood their culture, had watched it for 20 years. I'd adapted. That made me suspect, potentially corrupted, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with having experienced things the Imperium didn't want to acknowledge. I would probably be executed eventually, maybe months from now, maybe years, whenever they got around to the subtler cases. But for now, I was useful for the same reason I'd been useful to the orcs. I could translate, could explain, could bridge the gap between Imperial forces and the reality of what had happened here. The census in year 21, 1 year after liberation, counted 1.2 million surviving humans on Vardus Prime. We'd started with 11 million, lost 4 million in the invasion and first year, lost another 4 million over the next 19 years, lost another 1.8 million during the liberation itself, orbital bombardment and ground combat, and post-victory purges, combining to erase nearly as many people as 2 decades of Orc occupation had. The Imperium called it acceptable losses. They called it a victory. They called us survivors, blessed by the Emperor's mercy, and we nodded and agreed because disagreeing meant execution. But standing in the ruins of our world, surrounded by the ashes of 3/4 of our population, victory felt like a word that had lost all meaning. Half the survivors didn't want to be liberated. I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it. Want is complicated when you're talking about people who'd been shaped by 20 years of trauma and adaptation. But approximately 600,000 of the surviving 1.2 million had integrated into Orc society to one degree or another, and they resisted Imperial rule with varying levels of intensity. Some simply refused to cooperate. Passive resistance that made rebuilding difficult. Some actively sabotaged reconstruction efforts, destroying Imperial supplies or feeding information to remaining Orc holdouts. Some tried to flee into the wilderness, chasing rumors of Orc survivors, preferring to take their chances with the greenskins than submit to Imperial authority. The Imperium's response was predictable and brutal. Anyone suspected of Orc sympathy was arrested. Anyone who resisted arrest was killed. Anyone who'd fled was hunted down by Imperial Guard regiments and either brought back for tribunal or shot where they stood. By year 22, the population had dropped to 900,000. The Imperium had killed 300,000 people in purges, manhunts, and anti-corruption operations, more than the Orcs had killed through active violence in any single year of occupation. The irony wasn't lost on those of us who survived both, but pointing it out was heresy. So we stayed silent. We rebuilt because we had no choice. We raised new buildings on the rubble of old ones, human and Orc architecture, both ground into the foundation of something that was supposed to be imperial but felt hollow. We prayed in new cathedrals, built on the footprints of destroyed ones, words of devotion that tasted like ash. We went back to work in factories and agri-complexes, producing tithes for an Imperium that had abandoned us for 20 years and then killed 1/4 of our survivors when it finally returned. I'm still here, 43 years old now, translating documents in the Imperial administrative complex that occupies the same space the talkie place did. My job is the same. My masters have changed. I speak 3 languages fluently: High Gothic, Low Gothic, and Orcish, and that third one is kept secret, mentioned only in my official file and never in public, because speaking the tongue of the enemy marks you as potentially corrupted, even when it's your job to understand them. I have no family left. My father died in the occupation. I never married. Never had children. Couldn't imagine bringing life into that world, and now I'm too old and too damaged to consider it. I live in a small hab unit, eat ration packs that are somehow worse than what the Orcs provided, and work 12-hour shifts translating documents that describe Orc movements and culture for Imperial tacticians who think they understand the enemy. Were the Orcs worse, or was the Imperium's liberation? I've thought about that question for 2 years now, turning it over in my mind during sleepless nights, examining it from every angle like a puzzle with no solution. The orcs killed millions through casual violence and systematic brutality, reduced us to livestock, turned our world into their playground, and corrupted our children into green-skinned cultists. They were monsters, Xeno's abominations, everything the Imperium teaches us to hate and fear, but they let us live. Not out of kindness. Orcs don't have kindness, but because we were useful, entertaining, part of the ecosystem they'd created. We were slaves, but we were alive. We adapted, and that adaptation was itself a kind of survival, not noble but functional. The Imperium kills through calculation and righteousness, reduces us to statistics, turns our world into a production center, and purges anyone too corrupted by survival to fit their narrow definitions of loyalty. They are human, our own species, the glorious Imperium of man that spans the galaxy and protects humanity from the darkness. But they killed more of us in 2 years than the orcs killed in 20. Not through malice, through indifference, through doctrine, through the simple mathematical reality that the Imperium can afford to lose planets and populations because there are always more. Endless human worlds, producing endless human lives to feed into the endless war machine. We are numbers in ledgers, acceptable losses, collateral damage. We were saved, but I'm not sure we survived. Now you understand what liberation costs when the liberators and the occupiers are equally monstrous in their indifference to individual suffering. If you dare witness more truths about the Imperium's true face, subscribe. The Emperor protects, but from orbit we all look the same. I return sometimes to the central plaza, where war boss Scragclaw held court in his throne of crushed vehicles, where orcs raced and fought and lived with their brutal simplicity. The Imperials cleaned it up, of course, scrubbed away every trace of Xeno's presence, built a new statue of the Emperor where the throne room entrance had been. It's beautiful in an austere way, white marble and gold leaf, the Emperor rendered in perfect detail with his sword raised and his face serene. But I remember what was there before, the crude metal and the constant noise and the terrible vitality of it all. Life lived at maximum intensity without thought for tomorrow, because tomorrow might not come. The orcs were monsters, but they were alive in a way the Imperium has never been, has never allowed itself to be. I think about Keras sometimes, that boy who told me the Imperium was boring, who died fighting for the orcs because they'd become his people. He was 20 years old, had his whole life ahead of him, could have been anything in a world that gave him the chance. Instead, he died for green-skinned Xenos who'd invaded his world and reshaped his reality, and he died believing it was the right thing to do, the meaningful thing, the choice that made sense in the world he knew. Was he corrupted? By Imperial standards, absolutely. Was he wrong? I don't know anymore. He fought for the culture that had raised him, defended the community he belonged to, gave his life for something he believed in. That's what we're supposed to do, isn't it? Die for what we believe. The Imperium just assumed we'd believe in them, never questioned whether 20 years of abandonment might have broken that faith beyond repair. The spores are still here, of course. Orc spores never truly leave once they've taken root, settling into the soil and the water and the air, waiting for conditions to spawn new greenskins. The Imperium burns vast swathes of territory annually, cleanses suspected spawn zones with promethium and virus bombs, maintains constant vigilance against orc resurgence. It will never end. Vardus Prime will never be clean. The Orcs won in that sense, even in defeat. They've marked this world permanently, changed it in ways that can't be scrubbed away. In a few centuries, when the Imperium's attention is elsewhere and the cleansing teams become less thorough, the Orcs will come again. Maybe not as an invasion fleet, but growing from the spores, savage and feral at first, but eventually achieving the same brutal civilization they had before. And when they do, will there be humans left who remember the occupation? Will those humans resist, or will they adapt? Will the cycle repeat? I don't believe in the Emperor anymore. I probably shouldn't write that, even in my own thoughts, but it's true. The Emperor didn't protect us. He didn't save us. His Imperium abandoned us for 20 years and then killed 300,000 survivors for adapting to that abandonment. If he's real, if he's conscious in any meaningful way, he either doesn't care about individual worlds and lives. We're too small, too insignificant in the scope of his 10,000-year war. Or he's incapable of protecting us, which amounts to the same thing. The faith I was raised with, the certainty that humanity's survival depended on devotion to the Golden Throne, feels like a lie designed to make us accept suffering. We suffer for the Imperium, we're told. Our pain has meaning, purpose, value in the grand scheme. But when the meaning is too distant to perceive, and the purpose is indistinguishable from meaninglessness, and the value is measured in how many of us can die before the system stops functioning, what's the difference between that and simple exploitation? The Orcs were honest, at least. They conquered because they enjoyed conquering. They enslaved because they needed slaves. They killed because killing was fun. There was no pretense of righteousness, no claim of divine mandate, no suggestion that your suffering was noble or meaningful or part of some grand design. You suffered because you were weak and they were strong, and that was the entire moral framework. Simple, brutal, honest. The Imperium wraps the same brutality in ceremony and doctrine, addresses exploitation in the language of duty, calls suffering sacrifice, and makes you grateful for the opportunity to be ground into paste for the machine. Same result, more elaborate justification. I'll die here eventually, maybe of old age if I'm lucky, more likely of something more immediate. A purge when they decide my Orcish knowledge makes me too dangerous, an accident in the administrative complex, a random act of violence in a world where violence is constant. It doesn't matter. I'm already dead in every way that matters. A ghost walking through the ruins of two civilizations, Orc and Imperial both, finding them equally monstrous in their own ways. If there's an afterlife, if the Emperor's light truly does embrace the faithful, I wonder whether I'll be admitted. I survived, but survival meant compromise. I adapted, but adaptation meant corruption. I'm alive, but living meant becoming something neither the man I was before the invasion, nor the loyal Imperial citizen I was supposed to be could recognize. This is what it's like when Orcs occupy your world and get bored and stay anyway. Not the invasion, not the initial horror, but the years after. The slow, grinding transformation of everyone and everything. The adaptation that becomes corruption that becomes normal. The Orcs changed us. Fundamentally and permanently, and when the Imperium returned, they couldn't accept what we'd become, couldn't accommodate the reality that 20 years without them had forced us to become something other than ideal Imperial citizens. So they killed the parts that didn't fit, burned away the adaptation, and called it liberation. I don't know which was worse. I don't think there is an answer to that question. I think there are just two different types of monsters, green-skinned and human-shaped, and we were caught between them, crushed by forces too massive to resist or even fully comprehend. The orcs made our world theirs through conquest and culture. The Imperium reclaimed it through firepower and faith. And we, the people who actually lived here, who suffered under both, who adapted and changed and survived however we could, we were never asked what we wanted. We were never given a choice. We were just numbers in someone else's war, acceptable losses in someone else's victory, forgettable casualties in a galaxy where trillions die daily and individual lives mean nothing at all. The Emperor protects, they say. But from where I stand, surrounded by the ashes of 3/4 of my world's population, having survived monsters both Xenos and human, I don't see protection. I see exploitation wearing a holy face. I see the same indifference to individual suffering dressed up in different uniforms and speaking different languages. I see the machine that consumes everything. Orc or Imperial makes no difference. The machine that takes living people and turns them into components and fuel and casualties. The machine that calls this victory and moves on to the next world without ever looking back at what it's destroyed. This is forever. This is the Imperium. This is what we were always going to become. Orc invasion or no, because the Imperium was always going to grind us down eventually. The orcs just did it faster and with less pretense. In the end, we all serve something that doesn't love us back, that uses us until we break, that replaces us without memory or mourning. The only difference is which flag flies over our graves. I'm 43 years old. I remember the exact temperature when the orcs came. I remember the exact moment I stopped believing in salvation. I will die here, on this world that the orcs conquered and the Imperium reclaimed, and neither side truly cared about beyond its strategic value. My name is Davrin Kell. I survived. I'm not sure that was worth anything, but I survived. And I'm telling you this, whoever you are, whatever time you're hearing these words. The galaxy is full of monsters, and some of them look like your saviors. The question isn't which side you're on. The question is whether there are any sides that wouldn't consume you just the same. I never found one. The Emperor protects. They say that constantly. Repeat it like prayer, like truth, like shield against the darkness. But I've seen what his protection costs, and I'm not convinced it's different from the alternative. We were abandoned, occupied, adapted, liberated, purged. And through it all, we were never human to either side. Just resources, just numbers, just acceptable losses in a war that will outlast our species and doesn't care about our pain. This is what it's like. Remember it. Learn from it if you can. But most likely, just survive it, whatever form it takes in your world and your time, because that's all any of us can do. Survive until we can't. Serve whatever master claims us. Adapt until adaptation itself becomes the corruption they'll kill us for. The cycle continues. The machine grinds on, and individual voices, individual lives, individual suffering, it all disappears into the noise, forgotten before it even finishes screaming. The orcs are still out there, somewhere in the wilderness, spores waiting to bloom. The Imperium is here, building and purging and exploiting, and I'm here between them, dead in everything but name, waiting for whichever one gets me first. This is forever. This is what we fought for. This is what victory looks like when there are no good choices left, only different flavors of damnation. The Emperor protects. He doesn't. But we say it anyway. Because what else is there?